Here's an example of the best description I could think of to describe how Class D works. This is a virtual player piano. And you see the length of those bars that are coming down? That dictates how long the note plays. So watch that. And you see they're all well timed. Look at that. See the length of those bars? I believe the term for that is multi-timbral, where you can play multiple notes at the same time. To me, that's how Class D works, right? Some of them are long, some of them are short. The piano processes it. Hope that helps. Happy Saturday, everybody. We're going to start off this video, and this is for our Class D bass amplifier. We're going to start off by showing you where our progress currently is, and then after this we're going to show you some of the steps we've taken to get here. So what you see at the moment is that our power supply is completed. It's mounted in the case. We have an air hole right here and a grommet, which I will show you in a second. We have an aviation connector right here. This is going to come out. We have this clearly marked with the pins are. There's 4 pins in these things. And there's going to be 1 for ground, 2 for the filaments, and 1 for B+. And they're going to basically, this is called an umbilical cord. It's going to basically come around here and go into the same connection on this side in the preamp. So there'll be a short wire here like so. And because we have filament in there, we're going to twist the wires and try to use some shielding. So that's how we're going to connect the 2 pieces. In here, we obviously have our tube socket. You've seen that already. Here's our aviation connector. And we have our 4 potentiometers mounted in the case and sticking out the side. We also have our input in the front of the case, which I'll show you in a moment. And then lastly, we have our combination fuse, power switch, and AC receptacle mounted in the case there. So that's where we currently are. So the next step is going to be to build preamp underneath here. We have very limited real estate, but that's okay. That's what we're going to do. And then what's going to be next is I'm going to build the power section, because I could really start doing that now. I have to mount the power board right there. Let me show you. This is our 55-volt power supply that we're going to need to power the amplifier. It says it right there, and here's where the AC goes in. So we've got our ground and our neutral and our hot, and then coming out of here is where we connect to the power amp. So we're going to mount that somewhere around there. Again, I'm going to keep all the power on this side of the amp. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a series of terminal blocks to do this. And I'm going to use some wire snake to keep it all together. Something like this kind of material, and that's what's going to cover the wires and just keep them safe. I need to have 3 distinct connections. So I need 1 here for the fan, I need 1 here for the power supply, and I need 1 here for the power supply for the preamp. So I have to figure out how I'm going to lay that out. It's going to be a relatively short layout of tube here, but that's how we're going to lay this out. And I have to figure out where I mount the terminal blocks. That's all the part of the fun of this project, is figuring all this out. I can mount it sideways and have a little room in the back. Doesn't really matter, as long as I don't get in the way of my umbilical cord here and get in the way of anything here. I could even mount this here. I have plenty of real estate on this side. Okay? While I was checking out my video, Bentley was intently watching me, and this is his reaction to the video. Right, Bentley? Not even awake. So we're starting to build things here, which is always exciting. And what you're looking at here is the schematic that we're going to build for our preamp. Everything is on here. I'll put a copy of this also on the bottom in the description. And what I'm building today is the power section. So that's right here. Okay, these two lines that shoot up here are B+. So we want to put everything that's here into a small chassis. Okay, and basically you'll see we have a transformer here. I've already spoken about this. It's a Hammond 261 C6, and it's essentially 250 volt center tap at 48 milliamps, and it's got a 6.3 volt tap at 1 amp. And what you'll see here is our B+. We go through a pair of 1N4005s, and then we go to a 47 microfarad cap. We go through a 10K resistor, and then another 47 microfarad cap. And coming out of the end here, I've measured about 197, 198, which is respectable. Coming out of our filament transformer, we're going to convert the 6.3 volts AC to DC. And the reason why we're doing that is it will basically eliminate hum. Not 100%, but if we do things right, we'll have zero hum in this thing. So we're going through a full wave rectifier of 1N4005s, and we're going through a 100 microfarad cap, and we're going to our tube socket from there. So that's basically what we have. Let's take a look at the build. So here's the build. You'll see I got everything on one really small board. This is a very small chassis. Matter of fact, you can see from my pen that the chassis is smaller than a pen. So it's very small, not much to it. And we've got everything built in here. So this side of the board, from here this way, is our filament. And from this side of the board is our B+. So everything is in there mounted nicely. We've got terminal blocks here. We've got terminal blocks here which will go over to the preamp. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to have our AC. Here's the top. We have our transformer mounted. Here's our AC coming in, and we have a ground wire here which will attach to the ground. And then as we connect this thing to the rest of the preamp, we'll carry the ground through, so it's on a common ground. And I do have this terminal block right here marked. Let's zoom in. You can see that this one is colored black here. This is our ground connection that will carry through, and that's connected to the ground rail. And this is the ground coming in right here. So there's a ground rail that runs underneath. Also underneath here that you can't see is a pair of 220 ohm resistors, which is creating an artificial center tap for the filament. That's mounted underneath the board. So what's our next step? Well, our next step is, this is built, it's tested, I've plugged it in, I've measured it with my meter, it works great. We have to find a way to mount this thing. Alright, and that's going to be our next experiment, I guess is what you want to call it. And we're going to use something called Rivet Nuts to do that. Okay? I don't know if you've ever seen Rivet Nuts before. But basically, it looks like this. This is a 8-32 thread rivet. And what you do is you put them in here like this. Hold on a second. Sorry about that, the phone was ringing. So we have these 4 rivet nuts here, and the way these things work, I'll use one of the larger ones to demonstrate. The way these things work is you drill a hole, you put the piece through, this is the part where you put the screw in, and when you use the rivet gun, it collapses this section, this serrated section right here, and it creates a nice tight bond. Now what we're going to use to do this on ours is we're going to use something called an Astro Rivet Nut Gun, and it's a model ADN14, and it looks just like this. Essentially what you do is you put an 8-32 mandrel on here, like this. You take your wire nut and you screw it on the mandrel. So it's 8/32. These things are replaceable. It comes with several different sizes. You screw it on, you attach it to your cordless drill, and you have to use a drill that has a clutch. Okay? And when you do that, you squeeze it in there until it collapses the rivet, and you're good to go. So we're going to demonstrate one of those, okay, for you. Now, we have to use a 7mm hole. I've measured it. That's the size hole that we need. Okay? So I've identified that my step bit here, if I put a piece of tape here, and this is exactly 7mm. So we're going to do a 7mm hole right here. helps when you tighten the chuck down. There we go. Okay, right down to the tape. You don't want to go too much bigger, right? Because then you're gonna have a problem. Okay, so here's our hole. Okay, so if we take one of our rivets, you'll see that it fits in there perfectly. Okay. So next thing we're going to do, we already have a rivet attached to the tool. We pull this shot up so you can see the whole thing. Well, since Bentley's sleeping, I figured maybe Spunky would be interested, but look what Spunky's doing. I'm striking out here. Okay, we're going to take our bit off here. And we're going to connect the rivet gun, like so. Okay? And what you do is you have to hold this center while you drive it forward. Okay? Right, so right now it's going in reverse and it's not going to do anything because this thing is spinning with it. Let's go forward. Okay? Let me make sure I get the shot here. Let's see. So we're going to squeeze that in, and you're going to hear the clutch kick in this thing, and that means it'll be done. Okay. Now we're going to reverse. And then you reverse it, and then squeeze it. There we go. Okay. Had a little trouble getting that out of there. So right now you'll see, there's our nut, and if you look inside there, you'll see that it's collapsed really nicely, and we're good to go. We have an 8/32 screw here, which will fit in perfectly, and we'll be able to mount this thing from underneath, and this thing will be completely secure. Alright? Let's do one more, because that one was a little sloppy. Let's see if we could do this from a different angle so you can see it this time. Alright. That may be better. Okay, we're going to hold this piece. There you go. Now, last time I had trouble getting this piece out. There we go. It's out. And we have another perfect rivet. Right in the right spot. And it's perfect. Okay? So that's how we're going to mount this thing. That's really cool, isn't it? Great job. It's solid. It's not going anywhere. There's not a lot of weight on this thing anyway. But it'll mount really, really nicely in our cabinet. So what's next? Let me show you. Be right back. Just like that, we have our 4 rivet nuts installed. Of course, these two went really smooth. Not like the ones that I showed you. That's how it always works. Be back. Okay, to make our connection from here to the preamp, we're going to use something called an aircraft connection. You probably recognize these. I think these used to be used on Heathkit projects for microphone connections, I think, if I recall. But basically, it's a connector with a slot like that. And there's a competing slot here. And it goes like that, and you tighten it down. So what we're going to need between here is we're going to need the 2 filament wires that go to the 12AX7. We're going to need the 1B plus wire that comes out that goes to the preamp, and we're going to need our ground. So we have exactly 4 connections here. We're going to solder them. We're going to mount this here. This will actually sit like this in the case. So we're going to mount this right here. Oops, sorry about that. We're going to mount that right there, and then on the preamp we're going to mount this cable, and that's going to be our connection. It'll be solid, it won't go anywhere. So that's what we're going to use. So let me get the holes drilled for this, and we'll show you what that looks like. Okay, what we're going to do now is put in our aircraft connector. All right, I showed you this is what I'm going to use to do the jump between the two, the power amp, the power section, and the preamp. So we're going to put this, which is the male side, in here, and I've got everything color coded. So B plus is red, ground is black, filament is green. So we've got everything soldered, heat shrinked. Now we just need to take off this nut and mount it, and then simply attach it to these terminals. Let me do that, we'll show you what it looks like. Okay, we now have our connector fully installed. There it is, tightened in appropriately, fully wired, shortest wires possible. There's our filament line right there. Here's our B+, and here's our ground, and we'll be able to carry this over to the preamp using this connector. So now we need to wire this up, and we're probably going to use some shielded wire here in this thing for the filament, just to make sure that there's no noise introduced. And then, you know, the ground is the ground, that's easy. Okay, I think I found one that's interested. There's Bella. Bella, what are you watching? Are you watching doggy porn? Come on, Bella. The stuff I'm putting up is much more interesting. Bella? Another one that doesn't listen. So let me show you the controls and things, and we'll see where we go from there. Be back. Okay, right here is the inside of our combination power, fuse, and on-off switch. This is what it looks like. Here's the on-off switch. It mounts from the other side. I didn't put it in yet because it has these little snap-in tabs. I'm just going to use insulated spade connectors on that. And let's take a look at that from the outside. Where are we? There we are. Let's pull the shot back a little bit so you can see that. Okay. So there's our connection. There's where the power goes. There's where the on-off switch goes, and our fuse is in here. As I stated previously, I don't know if we need a 2 amp fuse or a 3 amp fuse. It's certainly going to be more than 1 amp. I know that for sure. But we'll do that calculation when the time comes and figure it out. So that's that. Let's go on the side here and look at the controls. I may have to raise this camera up a little bit. See if I can do this and get this in the shot. Okay, here's our controls that come out, and I've left them purposely long because I'm going to need to trim them. So up front we have our volume right here. Right here we have our treble. Right here we have our bass, and over here we have our mids. And I purposely put the mids in the back because the mids, when you're a bass player, the mids you really never really touch. You set that to where you like it, and you really don't have to worry about it. So it's basically the same is true for treble and bass as well, but those would be touched more. So I've got that there. I need to do a little bit of trimming and stuff just to make this fit a little bit better, but they're in there. If you look on the bottom, right here, this is where I have my my chassis mounted. These screws right here are for the power, and these are for the preamp, and I haven't put the screw in yet. We'll get to that. And then lastly, right here is our input. So this is where we're going to actually plug in the instrument when we're ready to play. And I'm going to find a way to put a little bit of a finish ring on there so it doesn't look so jagged and ragged. And I may have to make that hole just a little bit bigger, because sometimes a guitar jack can be a little bit thicker. So we'll make that a little bit bigger. But this is what it looks like at this point. Let's pull this back and see if we can show you the whole thing in one shot. Matter of fact, let me take it off the tripod and do that. Okay, here's how she looks. There you go. I also decided that I'm going to mount this air vent right here. It's got a screen on it. I'm going to mount that right here on the top. It's going to be right over the chassis. The two chassis, actually. And what will happen as air gets sucked in, it'll get pulled across and then come out the fan, which is going to be mounted here. So I'm going to create an airflow. Now the fan I'm putting in, I believe, is 100 CFMs. Now, typically when you have a fan of that size, you need to have air coming in of the same pressure, or you have negative airflow. So I'm going to have to see. I may need to put 2 of these. I do have another one. I may have to put one here and one here. And there's a calculation that you can do to determine if you have the proper ventilation coming in so it can come out. So I'm going to play that by ear at the moment. I'm not going to mount this yet until I do a little more research and figure that out. Okay? Last thing I want to talk about is this preamp. Okay? So there's our preamp. Here's our schematic, which I'll put in the corner right here, so you can take a look at it if you'd like. Why are we using a tube preamp? Okay? When you build a Class D amp, I could use something like this. This is a $10 preamp, right? It's got 2 RCA connections. You got treble, bass, volume, and mid. Pretty simple, right? Not much to it. So why do you want to use an analog preamp? Well, the real issue to me is sound, right? Many people swear that Class D amps suck, right? That they don't sound well, they're not good for instruments, guitars, basses. You don't get that warm tube feeling. And a lot of that has to do on personal preference, quite honestly. I'm not even sure that there's anything scientific that I could explain to you, except that I know that when you have a tube preamp, you get a much, what's the word I'm looking for? You get a much warmer sound. That I know for sure. I've played through some solid state amps, and I've played through, all tube amps, and there is a difference. It's again up to personal preference, and I don't know if there's a scientific explanation. But what I do know is if I have the right preamp here, and my signal is properly processed, and is generating the proper volume coming out into the amplifier is going to duplicate that. Okay? So I think I explained to you all that the way the Class D amp works is there's at the end of the chain there's a low pass filter that filters out all the unwanted noise. So the noise that that comes out the speaker is relatively true. There's not a lot of processing going on there. And I think our good friend Carl, Sky Carl, had a question about harmonics and things. And can this Class D amp handle that? Well, yeah, I think it can. Only because those MOSFETs are switching so quickly, right? That I think it can process the sound relatively well. I've tested it when I did my initial, testing on the amplifier setup, and I went to the 12th fret of the bass and did a couple of harmonics, and it was right there. There was no, it didn't sound fake. It didn't sound like it was processed. It didn't sound digital. It sounded like a harmonic. So, to me, that has to do with this preamp. If I had used the digital preamp, it could be a different story, I don't know. But one thing, like I told you we're going to do at the end of this project when we're done, is we're going to do kind of a shootout between this amp, which is a hybrid Class D, and a typical tube amp, and see if you can hear the difference. Now, it's going to be hard to do on a video camera, honestly, but we'll give it a shot anyway. So that's why we're building the preamp here. And again, we're using a standard Fender type layout, 12AX7. We've got the typical tone stack, and I think it's called a Bandaxol stone stack. I keep saying it backwards. Tone stack, and it's tried and true. It works. It's great. And I've already explained to you that I need to have 2 volts AC coming out the speaker in order to go into the amplifier. That's the measurement that we've taken. So I'm really, really comfortable using the tube preamp in this experiment. Matter of fact, if you want to see something that's comparison, I'll put a link in the description for an Orange amp. Orange is a company that's based in the UK. They started out in the 80s making computers. And they quickly realized that IBM, PCs that is, IBM and Dell and Gateway were going to put them under, so they switched to guitar amps. They also made a guitar amp line in the, I think in the early 70s. And I think I explained to you in the last video that, when, maybe I didn't, I forgot, when, back in the late 50s, when music was changing and evolving, right? We went from Frank Sinatra, the old standards, to a little bit of jazz, and then Elvis Presley, and it became more prominent for bands to have amplifiers, right? And you think about the early Beach Boys and all that stuff, and there was only one game in town basically at that point. It was Fender, right? Leo Fender perfected all this, and many copied it, but the issue was that it was clean. right? They never played them to distort. They played them to be clean. You listen to all those old records, clean. Nothing crazy there. And when the British music scene was evolving, they were a little bit more, rough cut, a little harder, right? You think about the early British songs like the Rolling Stones and, the Who and Pink Floyd and the Beatles even. There was a little more roughness to their music, much more than there was in the U.S., which is one of the reasons why the U.S. loved those bands. Well, you couldn't, first of all, in the UK, you couldn't get a Fender. It took forever to get a Fender amp over there. I'm not sure the reason why. I don't know if there was export issues at that point. Don't really know the history behind it, but you couldn't get it. So what happened over there is they developed their own brands of amplifiers that did more and, evolved a little bit. And you had your Voxes. And if you've ever seen an old Beatle picture or show that they did in the early 60s, they always had Vox amps. Orange was another one that was prevalent. Marshall was another one. So they took the Fender design and they modified it so that they can get a more gritty sound out of it. And I think I've showed you that if you put an amplifier on a dummy load and put it on an oscilloscope and you have it biased correctly, you can see the point of breakup. So that's exactly what you're looking for, is where the sound goes from pure to unpure. So that's the genesis of this stuff. So that's why it's important to figure out what your voltages coming out of your preamp are going into your amplifier, so that you know what your capabilities are. I know on this amp, I get really great breakup at about 7, and 7 is loud on a 200 watt amp. I'm never going to play distortion bass because I'm a bass player. If I was a guitar player, I would do it differently. I would change the cathode capacitor and block some of the low frequency signals and change things a little bit differently. But that's how I'm building it for me. So that's the history on this thing and why I chose the 2 preamp. Wanted to explain that to you. I'm going to end the video here. This is just a little bit of a quick update. I'm going to start building the preamp, connect the umbilical cord, connect the power, and the next episode you're going to see all of that installed, and we'll then focus on the fan, the ventilation, the output, which is going to be coming out this wall somewhere to the speaker. And then I want to show you what we're going to use for a speaker, because that's important too. We have to use something that can handle over 200 watts. That's what our amplifier is. So let me show you what we're going to use for that. I think you've seen one of these before, so this should be familiar to you. So let's finish with that. Be right back. Okay, this is going to be our speaker cabinet. It's fresh out of the eBay box, so I haven't cleaned it yet, but it's a Bell & Howell Filmo Sound speaker cabinet. If you remember when I built the Killer Joe, and I'll put a link to the Killer Joe video in case you want to see it, it's a very similar one. It's a little bit newer because it doesn't have the rounded edges, but it's a very similar cabinet. And it's got flocking on here, and it's got a really nice handle that's in good shape. And what we're going to do on this one, here's the back. You can see someone installed an output already, some modification. And this thing swings open, and you'll see that there's a speaker in there already. I don't think it's original because I don't think that's what Bell & Howell used. It probably is a replacement. But we're going to replace this with a bass speaker anyway, which is going to be probably 400 watts. We'll have a much larger magnet than that. And we've got a little storage underneath and stuff, and that type of thing. But this is what we're going to use to mount our speaker, and this will be the speaker cabinet for that amp. And I'll find a way to get the case to sit on top of here. I'm going to have to put some fairly large rubber legs on the bottom of that suitcase so that it sits on top of here and clears the handle. So that's how we're doing it. That's our project. So now I'll have one of these cabinets, which is a complete 2 bass amp, Killer Joe, and then we'll have this one, which is our Class D. So I'll have a matching pair. Alright, that's it for now, folks. Hope everybody has a great day. Stay well. Bye.